Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. Eduardo, how are you?
I'm doing well, Damien. How are you?
Very well indeed. Well, this week we have an interview with Valeria Moy. Valeria is the director of IMCO, the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, and one of Mexico's top think tanks. And she's a very influential voice on Mexico's competitiveness, nearshoring, growth, and in Mexico's case, lack of growth. So stay till the end and catch a great interview. We're also going to talk a little bit about stories that Mexico's going to put additional tariffs on Chinese imports, a little bit more on the Ades McCormick deal. And we're also going to talk about Fibra moving ahead on spinning off its industrial assets to Fibra NEXT, its sister REIT, or Fibra as they're called here. And then something on stablecoins and Bitso's big conference this week. So Eduardo, do you want to start with Chinese imports?
Yeah, we read in my old shop, as you call it, Bloomberg, that the U.S. government is probably going to increase or put tariffs on Chinese products as a way to, I would say, satisfy the U.S. on one end, but also protect local industries from cheap imports that are coming from China, that in many cases could be probably being subsidized by the state. There is a lot of talk about that the Chinese never compete in a fairly equal framework, and by putting those tariffs, it would level the playing field and probably would allow companies that are located in Mexico to compete favorably. It also, I think, indirectly by doing so, Mexico will stop being the scapegoat or the scapeway for many Chinese products to reach the U.S. The story mentioned that the tariffs would be put even in Chinese cars, which have been doing very well in Mexico. No cars are produced here from a China-owned company, but they've been selling their products in Mexico quite successfully. So that will be probably something that will change the equation. I don't know. It depends on how high the tariff is, and we'll have to wait and see what the Chinese government, how does it react to these potential tariffs. Apparently, they're going to be mentioned or will be included in the budget for next year. So I think it's an interesting development. I think this is something that Mexico should have done a long time ago in case those products that are hurting Mexican companies were being dumped into the Mexican market or were being hurting the survival of some industries. It's a bit late probably in some cases, but better late than ever. And I don't know how much this is above what they've already mentioned they were going to do earlier this year in terms of textiles and other products that were going to be subject to tariffs coming from China. But I think it does raise the issue of Mexico aligning itself with the U.S., protecting its own industries, and making sure that Chinese products compete in a level playing field. What do you make? Maybe it's even deeper than that, not Damien?
Well, I think that people have been talking about Mexico forming a customs union with the U.S., which, given the asymmetry between Mexico and the U.S., would basically mean Mexico copying sort of U.S. trade policy, which is a slightly scary thought at the moment, given that U.S. trade policy is so protectionist. But this is a move to sort of towards that. If it's confirmed, it's obviously not confirmed yet. Mexico replicating high U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. Mexico has a free trade agreement with the EU. U.S. has put 15% tariffs, so they would have to walk away from that trade agreement if they were to go even further and replicate tariffs on Europe or UK or Japan. But this might be a kind of halfway point, which is at least copy the US when it comes to China. I think that one of the issues Mexico has is it has this huge trade surplus with the US and a big trade deficit with China. And part of that only part of it, is Chinese goods coming into Mexico and then being sent to the US, maybe with a small value added being done in Mexico. So by putting these tariffs on US goods, coupled with the US putting 25% at this point tariffs on non-USMCA Mexican exports to the US. If you have these two tariffs in place, then you would expect that the deficit with China, Mexico's deficit with China, to go down, and then this surplus with the US, which is partly a re-export of Chinese goods, also to go down, and that would be good news when they're negotiating USMCA next year. That look, your deficit with Mexico has gone down, and we're also importing a lot less from China. So I think it's related to USMCA. It's related to this kind of inching towards a de facto customs union with certain countries, at least with Mexico. Obviously, Mexican businesses that compete with China, like any businesses around the world, are delighted to be protected by tariffs. But there's always downside. Consumers are going to pay higher prices for textiles, cars, especially kind of electric cars in the SUV sector, where China's doing really well. And then a lot of these big manufacturing companies, including US companies like GM, import a lot from China. And then like aluminium, and then they export the finished car or the finished car part to the US. They're going to have to pay more for it as well. So this could affect some competitiveness of Mexico. It's going to pay more for Chinese imports, and it's going to definitely affect the cost of living for low-income Mexicans, especially, that have become very enamored by these cheap goods from Temu and other sort of Chinese importers and so on. So there's as you say, there's some positive elements to it, but it's also going to lead to higher prices, needless to say.
Yeah, and the two-way system that happens always in trade policy, if you don't do it carefully, or it could backfire. But it has also some of the positive elements to it.
So we move on to the Ardez McCormick deal. I think you had some comments there.
It seems like Ardez, which we talked about last week, because of its a deal with McCormick to sell a quarter of the Mayonesa McCormick processed food business, is moving on with its split of its retail side of the business. That includes the Nutrisa. It's under the Grupo Nutrisa, which is this health food stores in shopping malls and in other places that sell ice cream, yogurts, and other healthy products. It also has the coffee chain Cielito Querido Café and the snack Chilambalam. They're moving ahead with spinning it off, and they're going to list it on the stock exchange, as they had mentioned, which is an interesting development. At least we will have a new name on our dwindling stock market, and they're going to do it through dividends. They're going to give shareholders a stake in the new company that will be listed there. Ardez did extraordinarily well after the announcement of the deal with McCormick. The share price rose 34.1% in one day, which reflected how undervalued the company was, and that the McCormick deal was a wake-up call to investors, in the sense that the company was worth much more. It's come down a bit, 9% since then, but it's still way above what it was before the announcement. And now with the Nutrisa spin-off, well, the company is moving on in setting up its strategy and planning ahead for the future in its two divisions that it has, as well as other places where it's focused. So just to wrap up what we had said last week with this moving forward with Nutrisa and the stock reaction that happened after the announcement with McCormick. What's your take?
Well, interestingly, McCormick also went up. You don't often see that when there's an acquisition of this nature. Usually, often the buyer goes down a bit because they're paying a premium, and the seller goes up. But McCormick was trading or is trading at 17 times EBITDA. They paid 12, roughly speaking. So it was a accretive deal for McCormick shareholders to go from 50 to 75% of the Mexican division. But it was also hugely positive for their shareholders because their multiple was, let's say, 7 times, so well below the 12. So everyone ended up a short-term winner. Ardez is now going to have, once the deal closes and once it's paid tax, paid down debt, it's probably going to have $350 million of net cash. So people in the market are wondering what they're going to do with the cash. Will they pay a giant dividend to shareholders, a cash dividend? Will they invest in a new line of business, or will they grow their stakes in some of their other businesses that they share with other companies? Because right post this transaction, I think Ardez is going to have 25% of McCormick, obviously, and then the 50% of Bahia de Mexico, 50% of Ardez del Fuerte, which in turn owns 50% of Megamex, and then 100% of Helados Nestle. So there's room to take further stakes in their existing businesses, or obviously pay a cash dividend. But as we said last week, this kind of highlights Mexican assets are very attractive to the big American companies, relatively fast growing kind of middle class in Mexico. And secondly, there's a big valuation arbitrage with the Mexican companies trading at big discount. So you could expect more transactions of this nature. Next week, it's sort of Mexico Investor Week in Wall Street. You have BIVA, the innovative stock exchange, has its big New York day on the next Wednesday. You have the Fibra day on the Thursday, Amex Cap on the day before, and you also have the U.S. Open, which no doubt is playing a role in why hundreds of Mexican investors and brokers are heading to New York, and then the U.S. investors are going to be there listening. I think Marcelo Ebrard is going, and a bunch of other Mexican government officials and CEOs of top companies. So it's going to be a big week, and I think one of the messages that there's some great assets in Mexico that potentially of interest to global investors.
Yeah, I mean the market here has been doing better than the Dow Jones or the S&P 500. It's gone up about 18%, while in America their stock exchanges have gone up as well. They're reaching record levels, but not as much. It's interesting. I guess we saw a lot of companies delisting because of poor valuations. I think this transaction and other things that are going on might keep the market upbeat as it has been so far this year.
Yeah, I mean the problem is, and I'm sure this will come up in the BIVA Day, are exactly that: the lack of IPOs. People are reluctant to sell shares in their company if they're going to get a low valuation. So, and as you said, in fact, the opposite has happened with companies like Lala have delisted, Bachocos delisted, and quite a few others, which a bit like Ardez were quite undervalued, strong brands, and they prefer to go private. So there's really just been and we could talk about that because there was some additional developments this week. There was the Fibra NEXT IPO in July. Fibra NEXT, for those that may remember from a previous podcast, is the industrial fibra or REIT of the Elman Fibra Uno group. It's a sort of multi-stage process. The first process was this IPO, basically to 4 or 5 Afores. There's been no liquidity since the IPO. The second stage, which they just announced this week, is going ahead, is that Fibra Uno is going to sell to Next its industrial properties in return for shares in Next. So Next was born with properties from the Elman family, which controls Fibra Uno, and as a result of that, you as an investor, you can buy assets in Fibra Uno, which will be retail assets or office assets, or in Next, which will be industrial assets. So they're basically separating the two things. Next, under this shareholders vote, is going to acquire another 9 industrial assets from Jupiter, which is basically the Elman company that holds their industrial and other real estate assets. And then they're going to get up about 180 industrial properties from Fibra NEXT. So it's going to be the biggest. It's going to be the biggest industrial REIT in Mexico, bigger than Macquarie. It's going to be, although it's not actually a REIT, bigger than Vesta, bigger than Prologis Mexico, which is a REIT. The cap rate has basically been fixed at 7.45%, which is a lower cap rate than Fibra NEXT's cap rate. So this will also unlock value just from a sort of arbitrage perspective. But I think investors tend to prefer to buy kind of one type of real estate product. And if you're a conglomerate of different real estate products, you often trade at a discount. So being a pure play is another reason why this could unlock value. And I think the plan is in a third and fourth stage is for Next to raise equity and presumably Fibra NEXT to sell the equity it's getting in Next. And then with this new equity, Next will begin to trade properly. Next will have the money to develop greenfield projects that are currently in the hands of the Ellman family, and grow and take advantage of the nearshoring sort of story between Mexico and the US, which despite Trump, has continued. And some of the latest kind of trade data that you're seeing between Mexico and the US shows Mexican exports, contrary to some expectations, are continuing to behave reasonably solidly. And also, unlike in the past, Next is going to be internally managed. There isn't going to be an external fee, or is being internally managed. And Fibra NEXT is also moving to an internal fee, which is something that investors have long asked for. So there's kind of a lot of moving parts in that, but it is a new company in the stock market, which the capital market badly needs after all these delistings.
Yeah, with more names. I mean, there aren't that many, but if we could have a few more names there, maybe some of the shine that the market has lost over the past half decade could come back. I mean, it seems the Mexican economy is struggling along. We'll hear more from Valeria in a moment, but yesterday, was it yesterday or the day before, we had the growth rate for exports. They're still going up. Imports are going up, not as fast as they did before, but things are moving on. On the other hand, we had a revision of Mexico's growth rate for the second quarter, which came down from 0.8 to 0.6, or on an annualized basis from 3.2 to 2.4, which is not a bad rate for the state of the world's economy. But things need to be improved in many spheres. We also heard for the first time Mexico's finance secretary, or Secretario de Hacienda, shoot a warning signal there that things are complicated. I had never seen that before from any official from the current administration, which I was a bit surprised because they were being so happy and rosy, and the situation that they were dealt with was not as promising as it looked. But they are beginning to, I guess, send the message that things might be a little bit less promising than they were before. So we'll have to see a lot of moving pieces in that end as well. So we'll have to see how all this moves the market or not, or brings in new companies or not, and what the authorities can also do to make listings easier. There is this new law that hasn't been, I don't know if the secondary law has been already presented, to make it easier for middle-sized companies to come to the market. There is a lot to be done, I think.
So moving on, Eduardo, to crypto. Mexico had a big sort of crypto fest this week, sponsored and organized by Bitso, the crypto exchange that has done very, very well over the last 6 or 7 years. The stablecoins, I think everyone probably knows at this point, they're some digital tokens pegged to the value of a traditional currency, usually the dollar, or Mexico says the peso, and they're pegged because they're backed 1-to-1 by reserves, by treasury bonds in the case of the US. So you you're getting your money back because the issuer of the stablecoin has the money in US treasuries to guarantee that return. Although in the past, at least, there were some questions about certain stablecoins, how stable they really were. But I think with the passage of time, there's much more confidence in stablecoins than there was, and that was helped by the Genius Act, which, as you know, was passed in July in the US, which kind of regulates issuance and exchange of stablecoins, allows banks to issue their own ones, and allows for sort of auditing of the stablecoins to ensure that they are indeed backed by treasury bonds, and that you can get your money back should you want to. But the big advantage is that through blockchain, you can send money from one person to another or one institution to another sort of instantaneously. Whereas obviously, if you're trying to do it through the traditional banking system, you normally have to wait, for the banks to be open, and then in addition to that, the traditional banking system is more cumbersome, more expensive, bigger spreads. Whereas stablecoins, in theory at least, allow you to send that money at very low or no cost, instantly, 24/7. So if you're going to a Western Union at 11 o'clock at night and you're in Mexico, the recipient of that money, you might carry FX risk, overnight under the traditional way of sending money. But with a stablecoin, you can lock in the exchange rate right away and take away that risk, as well as cutting your transaction costs. So anyways, this big event. Bitso's kind of going all in on Bitso Business, which they have sort of rebranded. They're separate to people going into the exchange to buy and sell Bitcoin and other cryptos. This really is Bitso Business is aimed to be the kind of financial rails for companies and individuals that want to send money around the world or within Mexico for that matter, or want to use stablecoins or Bitcoins as part of their treasury reserve. So they've rebranded, they've set up this kind of separate division within Bitso, and they've said to different people that stablecoins now represent, in the first half of this year, according to a story and white paper, 46% of all transactions on its platform involve stablecoin. So with massive adoption in remittances, SME payments, and treasury operations, and they've said separately that about 10% of remittances, so that's 10% of $60 billion, is going through Bitso. So it's quite a big development, and I think it's great that there's the Mexican company, Bitso, a Mexican-based company with a lot of U.S. capital behind it, seeming to be at the forefront of it, and that they managed to, according to LinkedIn at least, their conference was sold out, and pretty much every kind of major crypto player was a sponsor, and there was a lot of excitement about how this is evolving. Now, there are risks, Eduardo. I mean, I think it's fair to say that some people worry about some of these crypto companies not kind of being as heavily regulated as traditional banks, and therefore more open to abuse by people not paying their taxes or people using them, for money laundering purposes and so on. So I think there are some kind of regulatory and compliance concerns, at least from the central bank and from the CNBV, and then there are sort of concerns that there'll be maybe some sort of poor quality stable coins floating around that aren't actually backed one-to-one with assets, and so people could lose their money. And that did happen when FTX went under. So and that wasn't too long ago. So in the past, at least, there's some the concerns on some money laundering, on knowing your customer, on the regulation of crypto companies, and then the kind of the value of the stable coin, the actual value of the stable coin. But overall, Mexico's seeming to embrace this financial innovation, and Bitso's made some very key, strong hires recently, which underlines how seriously it's taking all of the regulatory and compliance issues. And it's good that a company that's Mexican and is very serious-minded about compliance is seeming to take the lead on this.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and I would only add that if I were Bitso, and who am I to say that, but if I were Bitso, I would be pushing forward to kick out of the system, of the ecosystem, those that are not complying with what they claim they are selling in stablecoin measurements. I think that's a much less volatile asset class than the cryptos that originally came, because they have this underlying asset that sustains or guarantees the value of the currency. But like you said, there are still too many issues out there. And if I were a serious player that is promoting and doing well in that new industry, I would be very much behind pushing forward so that the bad guys don't take over. Because when a contagion happens, sometimes the good guys get trashed by the bad guy. So Bitso should, at least in my mind, should be trying to make sure that the industry stays as clean and as no, I don't want to say regulated, but that it can keep itself on a good side of business before it goes into a crisis, which might happen, but you want to be prepared for that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I think the counter argument is, I mean, if Bitso already controls the FinTech Association in Mexico to a large degree, and the smaller players, many of whom are, just as compliant, if not more, have complained that Bitso is kind of uses its muscle to keep them out under the pretenses that they're trying to keep out the bad guys. So, there's a lot of jockeying going around. And a lot of the kind of regulations, quite heavily influenced by Bitso, according to Bitso, to keep the sort of integrity of the crypto market, according to some of the competitors to keep them out, right? So there's a sort of arguments both ways.
Yeah, I guess like in any other industry, you think that these barriers of entries are not to make it clean, but to keep you out. But maybe there needs to be a neutral arbiter there that is neither Bitso nor the newcomers.
Yeah, which is the CNBV and the Bank of Mexico.
Exactly.
But they're very stretched, right, with so many other issues going on. And these are quite complex issues as well,
Very much.
And often, as they're relatively new, outside the kind of remit of the traditional regulators' sort of know-how and toolbox.
Correct.
It's a real pleasure to have with us today Valeria Moy. As many of you know, Valeria is head of IMCO, the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, one of Mexico's most respected top think tanks. Valeria is a leading voice on Mexico's competitiveness, nearshoring, growth, poverty. She's an economist. She has her own brilliant podcast, which I recommend. Valeria, thank you very much for joining.
On the contrary, Damien, thank you for having me.
Valeria, so why don't we kick off with Plan Mexico, the president's initiative to get Mexico to produce rather than import a lot of products from China and other countries. Do you think there's any substance? What needs to happen for it to make a genuine impact on Mexico?
I think there is indeed some substance, but I think it's falling short of the expectations that it created, especially at the beginning of this year. The Plan Mexico, yes, it's an import substitution plan. Basically, it's an industrial policy plan. When I heard the idea behind Plan Mexico, I was sort of excited because it was a plan. We were having something to start working on. There are some things that I like of the Plan Mexico. One of them is the idea of working in regions instead of working in states. So they have this just a broad thought of working like, the border or some part of the south or some part of the center of Mexico, instead of let's move Aguascalientes or let's work in Sonora. They're planning on working in regions. And sometimes I think that the moment that Mexico is in, it requires the work in regions instead of individually. So that's one of the things that I liked. Another thing that I liked is that it's a comprehensive plan. When we used to have industrial policy plans, they weren't comprehensive. And what do I mean by this? They're thinking of building like entire cities instead of just put this industrial park or this bunch of industrial parks in some part of the country. They're planning on how do we build this industrial region with housing, with electricity, with universities. How can we develop the talent that they are going to need in that part? So that's one of the things that I liked in the Plan Mexico. However, it hasn't come through. It's been falling short of expectations. The deadlines that the even the own Plan Mexico established, when it was presented by the president in the morning press conference, it established very clear deadlines, and none of them have been accomplished. Apparently, they work or they have meetings every couple of weeks with the president to evaluate the progress of the plan, and nothing is moving. So that's one of the things that worries me, because when you have very clear metrics, you can follow those metrics. So if we follow those metrics, nothing is happening with Plan Mexico. So the idea behind it was okay. I don't think it's it's coming up to the expectations that it created.
And why is that? I mean, almost every day Ebrard is photographed with some Mexican businessman saying, I'm supportive of Plan Mexico. The president talks about it at least, scores of morning press conferences. Altagracia, seems to be focused on it more or less full time. Why do you think they're not meeting the deadlines?
Because it's one thing what you say, and it's another thing what you do. And I think the president has been trying to respond to President Trump's threats all the time for most part of this year. And she's she's a micromanager, the president herself. So she's trying to solve every issue that is coming through, and the Plan Mexico has been lagging in the priorities. They are trying to solve other issues that are more urgent or more urgent for the president of the United States, instead of trying to implement the Plan Mexico. When I hear the same things that you listen, Damien, that you were commenting on, like the businessmen are always saying, oh, they're very happy about Plan Mexico. Yeah, they say they're very happy about Plan Mexico, but they're not putting any money on Plan Mexico. And there's another thing with the Plan Mexico. Plan Mexico doesn't have any budget assigned. It has very little budget assigned. So if you want to build huge it's not an industrial park, industrial regions in the country, you have to put money on it. And there isn't any resources assigned to that. And there's another major issue with the Plan Mexico. There's no energy. And if you don't have energy, how are you going to build basically anything? That's a big mystery for me. Why hasn't the president solved that issue? Because I don't think it's very complicated to solve. I think you just have to. I mean, I'm not trying to say this is simple, but you just have to open the flow of the energy projects, and it would fix rather soon, because it's so bad. The situation is so bad that it would fix rather soon. And it hasn't been done. And that's a mystery for me. I thought it was going to be a quick win for the president at the beginning of her term. I thought it was going to be one of the first things that she changed. And changing that area, it will solve many other issues, but it hasn't been done. So that's one of the major concerns of the Plan Mexico. How are you going to build anything, even more so an industrial region, if you don't have energy?
But surely it would be better for the government, which has, like any government, limited time, limited budget, to focus on those bottlenecks to growth, like energy, like water, like transportation, rather than trying to take on the whole sort of industrial supply chain in Mexico.
That's exactly what I think. I think it's rather, you have to start by the main issues. And one of the main issues is energy, not only in the north, also in the south. The south cannot grow. I mean, let's forget about industrial regions in the south. Just like the basic growth, the south will not be able to grow if they don't have energy at all. And then you have other issues like talent, like education, like housing, that you won't be able to attract people if you don't have those basic conditions. So yes, I think that energy is one of the things, one of the major bottlenecks, and another one is infrastructure. And when we think about infrastructure, sometimes we think about these huge projects, and I don't think we have to think about those grandiose projects of infrastructure. Let's think about customs, or let's think about the ports or the airports, and you have huge bottlenecks there.
Valeria, how are you? Eduardo here. I want to to ask you if you felt, and maybe this is an old-fashioned looking at industrial policy, that the Plan Mexico, although also doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, doesn't seem to pick certain industries where Mexico could excel, like other countries have done with their industrial policy. Is that something that you would have liked to see as well?
There's one thing in the Plan Mexico, Eduardo, that worries me. They talk about vocations. They say that some state or some region has a vocation to produce whatever they decide. And I don't think the states or the regions should have vocations. They should have competitive advantages, and they should try to focus on them instead of talking about vocations, because that's a very weird term for me to focus on. We should start trying to analyze what are the competitive advantages of every single region or every single state, if you want, and try to focus on them. And that's one thing that the Plan Mexico I don't like at all. Because the Plan Mexico says we're going to decide the vocations of every industrial park or every industrial region, or these poles that the Plan Mexico is calling. And I don't like that. Why is why is somebody in the government going to decide the vocation, quote unquote, that every industrial park should have or any industrial park should have? So that I don't like. And because if you do that, then you're going to, the second temptation that you're going to have is to try to guide investment towards that specific vocation. And that never works. And we've seen, examples all over the world. That never works. So that's one of the things that I don't like of the Plan Mexico. But yes, I do like some things about it. Like, yeah, we have, I think that the chain of production is rather fragmented, and there's some opportunities there.
In that sense, and looking at, and maybe I'm deviating a little bit from the industrial policy discussion, don't you think that the Mexican economy's performance should have brought up the need to move this plan with all its upheavals or lack of drafting up in Sheinbaum's priorities? The employment in Mexico is really tumbling down. Industrial production is not growing. Investment is not growing. Is this optimism that the president says every morning about how well we're doing blinds her of the reality?
Well, I think the president, is following her predecessor, optimism, but it's kind of void when you hear the president all the time. When you are always optimistic, sometimes you're never optimistic, but that doesn't worry me. What worries me is the false optimism that I see in investors. Because not in the president. The president, I think that's her job. That's her job. She's a politician. She's going to tell us what she thinks that we need to hear. But when we hear investors saying, "Oh, this is great," and they're moving their funds, they're moving their production companies elsewhere, that's when I think, so that's kind of a fake optimism, or they are not investing at all. It's like, that's fake optimism. For me, optimism is when you do what you say. So if you're going to say this is great, okay, put your money there. If you say this is great, but I'm going to invest somewhere else, that's not optimism. So I think, yes, it should have been one of the priorities of the president, but it hasn't been, because she's dealing with the uncertainty that President Trump is creating, but she's dealing as well, and this is her own making, with the uncertainty that has been created by the judiciary reform. So she's dealing with that, and then she's creating more uncertainty with the electoral reform. So, and that's of her own doing, despite whatever President Trump is going to do. So it makes me wonder what her priorities are. You can't have 1,000 priorities, because if you have 1,000 priorities, none of them is a priority. So I would have thought that the Plan Mexico was one of the main priorities. But to be honest, right now, I don't think it's in the top of her mind.
Now, it's interesting what you say, and I agree that the investor community is saying great things but doing very little things. I think they could have moved that agenda higher up if they were to be honest. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, investors, if you don't have energy, if you don't have certainty of your investment, if you don't have resources, if you don't have fiscal opportunities, if you don't have, you are not going to invest. If you don't know what the tariffs or the fees or whatever are going to be, you are going to hold your investment until you have some more certainty. And currently we're just waiting. That's the external part, that's the exogenous part, the Trump part. But what about the domestic part? What are we doing with the judiciary? So everybody's waiting to see how that plays out. And we're not going to see that until the beginning of September. So I think this year is going to be rather flat in investment. I don't think we're going to see huge, outflows of investment, but we're going to see flat investment in the best case. And then investors are going to wait and see what's going on with the judiciary and with the external conditions.
Valeria, we saw this week and last week very good news on poverty reduction in Mexico. I think from 2018 to 2024, 13 million people were taken out of poverty, from over 40% to under 30%. Isn't that sort of validation of the 4T, the 4T model? Ultimately, they're helping the least well-off people get better off and have and have their well-being improved through higher wages.
Yes, I mean, I think that the news that we had on poverty were great. Indeed, they were very good. One of the main things that drove people out of poverty, or basically the main thing that drove people out of poverty, was income, and it was labor income. Many people think it's transfers or social programs, and it's not. It's labor income. And labor income grew a lot during the past administration. Actually, if you take the growth of real income without considering inflation, it grew 30%. So no wonder whatsoever that we had those numbers on poverty. And those are great news. I don't know, Damien, if it's, yes, I don't know if it's a validation or not, or of the 4T, whatever the 4T is. I don't want to go there. What I do think, it's income was very, very stagnant for many years. And the move that President Lopez Obrador made, pushing the minimum wage up, made the other wages of the economy move up as well. And that was great for the poverty rates. And then on top of that, you had social transfers. And on top of that, you have remittances. But the main driver of getting people out of poverty was labor income. So, yes, that's great news. However, and this is the part that it's not that worries me, but it's one thing that we have to consider, is how sustainable it is. Because if you're not having economic growth, it's going to be very difficult to keep on pushing wages upwards. You can do that when the wages or the average wages are under the median wage. And now the average wage is pretty much where the median wage is. So if you try to keep on pushing wages up and you're going to move up the median wages, that's going to break the labor market. And that's going to be very complicated to keep on moving if you don't have economic growth. So yes, it was good news. Definitely were good news. And we have to recognize that. And actually, it's great news for the president, not for the past president, but for the current president, that is going to, reap the, this advantage of the poverty rate. However, she's not going to be able to keep on pushing wages as President Lopez Obrador did, because we are moving from a different level. Lopez Obrador started moving the minimum wage where it was very low, and now it's not that low. So she won't have that margin of pushing wages up just by decree. We are going to have to do something else regarding productivity or regarding economic growth. And that sounds much more complicated than just moving the minimum wage.
You had a great interview in your podcast a while ago now, Peras y Manzanas, with Santiago Levy, if I remember correctly. And Santiago's obviously well known for arguing that Mexico needs to formalize employment to raise productivity and therefore make these labor wage increases that we've seen over the last 7 years sustainable. Well, if Sheinbaum called you tomorrow and said, I buy into Santiago's argument, but unfortunately Santiago is going to stay in Washington, so it's now up to you, Valeria, to help formalize Mexico's labor market and economy, what 3 or 4 things would you suggest that the government does that are doable?
One of the theses that Santiago has is that this fragmentation of the labor market that we have to completely undo it. And that fragmentation, the only way to undo it is to change completely the social security regulation in Mexico, the social security model. So now we have a social security system that is tied to your job, that is tied to your activity, to your labor activity. And what Santiago says is like, we have to break that and we have to have universal social security, regardless of the kind of work that you do. And in that way, you are going to disappear the differences between formal and informal job market. So, because the law that we have now is tied to the formal job market. So if we change that and move towards a universal social security system that is funded by consumption taxes, basically the VAT, will be the only solution. I don't know if that's the way to fund it, but I do think, completely agree with Santiago, that we have to change our laws regarding formality or informality. That regulation, comes from the 50s, from the 1950s, where we had a very different population. And now we have to adapt to that. That's basically the only way to do it. But that's not in the conversation at all, because that would require a complete change of the labor regulation. And I don't know if any politician right now would want to go there.
Now, Valeria, speaking about this topic of formality and informality, one of the things that people were worried about raising the minimum wage was inflation. That has proven to be not the case. However, the other element that is crucial is the impact of higher wages on formal and informal jobs. That if, like you said, goes above a certain level, it could generate greater informality. The numbers from the IMCO on private sector job creation have been very dismal for the past 5 months, but I could go even further, maybe even to the beginning of last year, where really growth of jobs in the private sector started declining. Are you at IMCO doing any research on whether higher wages are impacting the formal economy by discouraging people to hire workers in the formal way?
We're not doing any specific work on that, but I think that's something that is happening, and that has happened always, all the time. When you make one market really expensive and the other market, whatever market it is, if you make the other market without any regulation at all, so suddenly the other market, you're making one more expensive, so the other one's cheaper. And it's not illegal. So you can move with the many different definitions of work that we have. And one thing that Santiago Levy always says that has made me think a lot about is that we think of the formal and the informal market as two completely separate areas. Either you're formal or you're informal. And that's not it. That's not what happens. Maybe you have a formal job and you have an informal one. Or maybe you have one job that is formal and then you move. When you move in life, you move towards an informal one. And then you go back to the market, to the formal market. So it's not a completely separate markets. You have, sometimes you swim between both oceans. And that makes regulation very complicated. So the only way to solve that is to eliminate those differences. Otherwise, when you make these very tight regulations towards the formal market, so minimum wage and more vacation days, and it's like you start pushing and pushing and pushing the regulation, we forget that 54% of population of the occupied population in Mexico is in the formal market, in the formal sector. So when you put any other regulation, any other perk to the formal market, you are making the informal market more attractive for employers. And we have to know that. It's very easy. So that's one of the reasons that President Sheinbaum decided to push for the formalization of this platform, Ubers and Didis workers, because in that way you push the numbers, the formal numbers up without having real jobs and real quote unquote, because of course if you're an Uber driver you have a real job. You might not even qualify for the social security system if you don't have any other systems or any other metrics, but you are going to be registered. So the numbers are starting to be a little bit, I don't want to say distorted, but you have to take into consideration that. So we're, instead of making the job market one single market, we are fragmenting it every single day even more.
That wage increase, which is really good of what happened in terms of
course.
But it's also having this second handoff effect in job creation, I assume. No,
yes, you're creating another distortion. So yes, I completely agree that all the workers should have social security system, all of them. But then solve the issue from the core instead of making, this patches all over the labor regulations that we are doing. We have to simplify the market instead of making it more complicated.
And moving a little bit to the competitiveness of the Mexican economy, one of your areas of expertise, what can you tell us about this dismantling of the autonomous agencies, and what's your take on how are they being repackaged under the structures of the government? Do you think that will qualify first for the USMCA, and second, will they have enough technical expertise to be really independent?
I don't think it's going to be an issue in the revision of the USMCA, in the review of the USMCA, to be honest with you. Yes, I think that it violates the law and the spirit of the letter and the law and the spirit of the USMCA, but I don't think it's going to be a huge issue in the revision. I think we're going to have other issues, but those particular ones, I don't think they're going to be a huge issue for the US or for Canada. For Mexico, it's another thing, but for the US and Canada, I think they are going to let us pass with that. My concern here is not the same for Coneval or for the disappearance of Coneval or the disappearance of the CRE or the disappearance of the COFESE. I have different concerns. For example, with Coneval, I am not worried that INEGI took that responsibility at all. When I see the area of INEGI that is going to handle this, I think they are very solid, technically speaking, and they're very respectful of the data. And actually, the source of information that Coneval used is the same that it's produced by INEGI. So I don't think that's where we're going to have an issue. But there's another thing that we forget about Coneval. Coneval was in charge of evaluating every single social program that we had, every single one of them. And Coneval said, well, this has a net present value of whatever, and this is going to help this population, and this is going to do this here and this, that. Now, that responsibility doesn't fall into INEGI, it falls into Hacienda. And Hacienda is in charge of assigning that specific responsibility towards other institutions. And Hacienda hasn't done anything about it. So we think about Coneval, about the measurement of poverty, and that's great. That particular area, now INEGI is going to handle it, and is handling it very well. The other part, we're going to miss it completely because Hacienda will forget about it. And the other parts, COFESE, I think that's important. That's a very important one. And the CRE, that's a very important one. And those are going to be inside the ministries that supposedly were independent of. So I have more concern with COFESE and with the CRE than the concern that I have with Coneval. And that's going to be an issue not for the USMCA, but for us, for Mexico, for the Mexican economy.
Well, Valeria, let's talk about that later on. I think we have to see how it all falls up.
Exactly.
Thank you for your time and sharing your points of view on these very central topics of how the Mexican economy is doing and how it can be improved or not. Let's keep the conversation going.
Great. Thank you, Eduardo. Damian, my pleasure.
Thank you, Valeria.
So to wrap up, Eduardo, did you see Cadillac has chosen Checo Perez as its one of its two riders, one of its two pilots?
Yeah, that was. It was always like, will it happen? Will it not happen? And finally, we have our Mexican driver back in the circuit. That's great news, I think, for fans of Formula One, which many are growing in this country. So that's why I think a little bit Checo got the nod. I mean, he has big supporters behind him, big companies, mainly Carlos Slim Jr. And all of America Mobile and all the Latin American presence that they have. So I think it's fantastic. And Valtteri Bottas is a very well-liked co-driver of him. So I hope they do very well. It's not going to be easy. It's a very competitive sport, but having Checo back will bring back a lot of viewers to these races. Are you a fan?
I'm very happy for Mexico. Checo is, despite I think he had a rather poor performance recently. He's obviously an iconic figure in Mexico, and it's great to see him back. The form. Well, he won't be racing this year, but next year it's always different when you go to Formula One, and I've been a few times to see Checo riding because it creates this excitement. Now he's, I think he's had about 6 wins or so, and 200 plus starts. So it's going to be much more difficult for him now under Cadillac, new car, to kind of repeat the success he had before.
No doubt. It's a very difficult sport. But to be honest, he's the best driver Mexico has ever produced, regardless of however it wants to view him, whether he failed or not, or whether he had many hopes and didn't fulfill them. I don't know, but it's an impressive thing that he does. When you see how these cars move and how fast they go and the concentration that you have to have, it's impressive, and we should only just be happy that he's among the 20th. Well, there will be 22 next year, 22 best drivers in the world. That's an amazing feat. No matter whether you come in 22nd place, it's still very impressive from my humble perspective.
For sure. Do you think rich Mexicans will now, instead of driving Ferraris, will be driving Cadillacs? Do you think when we go down Masaryk, we'll see lots?
I'm not a person that gets pulled by the brands and the people that consume them, but I guess that's why they have these people. So I'm sure they will. I mean, maybe we will see more Cadillacs out there now, and that's what Cadillac is trying to do, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, now that Chinese cars are going to cost double, maybe Cadillac, maybe Cadillac will become some kind of retro brand. And I think it's also, I mean, although the GM guy said, that Mexico's a big market, which it is, and this is partly the reason why he was picked. The other reason is that I don't think there are any great experienced American drivers right now. So it was sort of Checo or non-North American driver.
The American drivers concentrate more on the other type of racing, the NASCAR and all these other formats. The Formula One is more European. A few Latin Americans have succeeded there, more than a few. We have some Asians now driving there. So, I think and Checo is a Latin Americanist in that sense. He has also followers in other Latin American countries. There is this new young Brazilian that is driving for Sauber, which is quite good. and we have the Argentine for Alpine. So there are a few, but I think Checo will be a big name that will probably entice more Latin Americans to follow the races. So let's go to the races, Damon.
Look forward to it. Well, that's it. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Damien.